Hello, my Power Riders. This is Sean Hygen from Verb Cycling. I'm the Director of Education for Verb Cycling, and I wanted to welcome you all to our weekly webinar series, Power Simplified. This week, we're going to go over how to achieve peak form for your big event. And let's just go over a few tips for the webinar. It is being recorded for those viewers who couldn't attend the live session. So you've all been muted to ensure the best sound quality possible. If you do have a question during the webinar, feel free to use the chat box. I have it open on a separate monitor, and I'll be checking it throughout the session, and we'll answer the questions as they come up. I will also email the presentation out to you with the YouTube link as soon as it's available. Some of you have requested the first webinar slides too, and I will email those out as well. So thanks for joining me today, and let's get started. What is it that every athlete wants to achieve for their A race or their target event? It's top form or peak form at the right time. In the past, it may have been a bit of a mystery for you. It may have seemed like a little bit of a magic if you had a great coach. Maybe it was luck, or maybe you've never been lucky enough to actually feel like you've hit your peak form. The good news is now that you have an InfoCrank and you have access to cycling analytics, we can pinpoint your exact fitness level currently and leading up to the event. So with the proper tools, you can take the guesswork out of peaking. It all starts with something called training load. Remember this chart, and remember training load. This chart is your new best friend leading up to the Haute route. What is training load? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a measure of training workload. By combining how long and how hard you rode, we get one number that represents the physiological toll or how taxing the ride was for you. Some people think that when they first start using training load that you can't ever have a score over 100 because a 60-minute all-out effort with no warm-up and no cool-down yields a value of 100. So then they think, oh, well, how could I get more than, if they see a ride and they're like, wait, something has to be wrong. I had 125 training load, or I had 150 training load, or 200. There's nothing wrong. It just means that you rode for longer than an hour. That's the way to accumulate loads greater than 100. So, for example, if you went out for a 3-hour ride, you might get a training load value of anywhere from 150 to 200. So just to go over it again, training load takes into the account intensity, duration, and frequency, and comes up with a number that represents the physiological toll or how taxing a ride was for you. Remember, it's how hard is hard, right? So now that we've got the what about the how? So for data geeks out there, including myself, I put up the formula here and I broke it all down, but you don't need to actually know this or even remember it if you don't want to, because cycling analytics calculates it all for us. I did want you, though, to get used to seeing some common terms that I've been going over, and that would be intensity, which is how hard the ride was, effective power, and functional threshold power, which I think by now we all know what functional threshold power is, but it's the maximum amount of watts that you could sustain for a 60-minute all-out effort. I can tell you that I rarely see values of 100 TSS with 1-hour rides. It's actually pretty rare unless you're going out for that 60-minute time trial. An effective power is the estimate of the power that could have been maintained for the same physiological cost if power output had been constant. So basically, it takes into account how surgy or how variable or how aggressive the ride was versus a steady state TT. So for example, if you race in criteriums, you'll very likely have a lower average power but a higher effective power because it's taking into account all of the surges, the attacks, the jumping out of corners, etc. And I just wanted to note that all of these methods and terms were developed by Dr. Andrew Coggin. So what happens if you want to start logging your training on cycling analytics, and some of you, I think, are just getting your InfoCranks now? No problem. You can still put in training load and you can still create a training load chart. Cycling Analytics lets you manually add workouts and estimated training load. I'll go over exactly how to do that in a little bit. But now none of you have any excuse not to be logging those training sessions. So here's a chart that shows the approximate values and the corresponding, whether it's rate of perceived exertion, average heart rate. I know some of you have trained with heart rate in the past, and then the corresponding TSS per hour. So this gives you a way to, one, put in manual workouts if you had to ride a bike that wasn't yours, and you didn't have you didn't have your InfoCrank on this borrowed bike, so you could still put in a TSS relative to how the workout was. Also, at some point where you'll start to put in planned workouts in the future, and this will give you an idea depending on what workout you or your coach has planned. And you can also put in a corresponding planned, it's TSS here, but we call it training load on Cycling Analytics. TSS and training load are interchangeable. Questions on that? Okay. I know I'm running through pretty fast today. So remember the first couple of webinars, I stressed the importance of two key metrics that I needed everybody to put into Cycling Analytics. Well, this is actually why they're so important. In order to calculate training load, Cycling Analytics has to have your functional threshold power and has to have consistent and accurate data. Inaccurate data, including incorrect FTP, and this all means nothing. So it's really, really important. By now, you should all have an idea of what functional threshold power is, either through previous workouts that you've done or even races, or some of you have gone out and done the 20-minute test and used 90 to 95% to calculate your estimated functional threshold power. Early on, I did ask for another metric. It was weight. Doesn't directly relate to calculating peak form, but it's an interesting statistic where we can compare watts per kilogram against riders instead of just watts. It's comparing apples to apples, but that's another webinar. Another way to think of the training load chart is to think of it as fitness over time. I sometimes see athletes that get hung up on analyzing every single workout down to the watt and the second, and it's okay. Believe me, that definitely has a value. You want to look at your daily workouts and you want to see what you're doing, if you're doing the prescribed workout and hitting your target watts or all those types of things, or looking at cadence and speed and the routes. It definitely has a value, but I also like to use a famous quote or a well-known quote, at least in the United States, so maybe some of you or most of you have never even heard of it, and it's remember to see the forest for the trees. And basically what that means is don't focus only on the small details, which is each individual workout, and fail to understand the larger plans or principles, which is the training load chart. So a single workout is a tree, and the forest is your training load chart, your fitness over time. Each ride file has its value, but collectively as a whole, your files will start to paint this picture or create this awesome chart that reflects your season, and then you start to see the trend. I've coached a lot of athletes year on year, and it's so cool because I can just take a look at their training load chart, and I remember exactly what happened during the season by their peaks and valleys, and I don't even have to look at like specific dates or anything. I just see the trends, and it really does become crystal clear. So now let's go back to that first chart that I showed you at the beginning. Actually, this is the one I want, sorry. That I showed you at the beginning, but now I've marked it up a little bit, so it's going to make actual sense to you. Now you get to see long-term stress, short-term stress, stress balance, daily training load, all in one chart. Sounds great, but what the heck do those things mean, right? So long-term stress, which is the blue line, is your fitness over the past 6 weeks, 42 days. Your short-term stress, which is the orange line, is your fatigue, which is the last week of training. So basically what it is it's a rolling average. The long-term stress is a rolling weighted average of the last 6 weeks of your daily training load numbers. And the same thing for short-term stress. It's a weighted rolling average of the last week of training. Stress balance is the gray line, and that's fatigue or form or freshness. The yellow bars at the bottom, that's your daily training loads. Those are individual scores for each workout. And the dashed lines are anything in the future, and that's really the key to achieving peak form for your key events coming up. So at a glance, you can see that this rider, actually it happens to be Brian Taylor, the president of VERP. You guys should all get a chance to, I'm sure you'll get a chance to meet with him and hopefully ride with him at the upcoming Haute routes, because I think he's going to try to do some of each one, or he'll for sure at least be at all three. But you can see here is his general blue line is the fitness level. He puts in, a pretty good training period of time here, and then he really puts in a big massive bump here. So you can see his blue line going into it, his fitness. His gray line is above 0, so he's fresh. He was ready for this. And this looks like it was maybe a week-long or 2-week-long training camp. And while he is training, he's definitely getting fitter, but you have to remember that your fatigue is always going to build faster than your fitness. So you kind of think of it as how you feel after a training camp. You go and you kind of beat yourself up day after day and you put in all these miles. Well, the day to go to a race isn't the day after you come home from training camp, right? Or the day you come home from training camp. You're usually pretty tired and in the hole and you need some rest. And then you recover from that training camp, and that's when you go to your big race or your big ride and you feel fresh and ready to go. So he's definitely putting in a lot of training. Yeah, his fitness is going up, but that stress balance is just really going through the basement. And then he comes home from his training camp and he recovers and he lets that stress balance go back above 0 into the positive, and you see what happens to his fitness. So going in here, coming out here. Pretty big jump in fitness once he recovered from it. Then he can actually see the benefits of it. So does that make sense to everyone? So now let's talk about those dashed lines over here. Predicted long-term stress, short-term stress, stress balance is how you actually achieve peak form. So based on your previous workouts and training loads, you can now enter in cycling analytics on the rides page, workouts and planned training load. That's how you get those dashed lines. So I'm guessing that many of you have done repeated workouts or done the same workouts over time. What you do is you look at those previously done workouts and you say, hey, maybe this was a day I had 2 by 20-minute intervals in an hour and a half and I had 100 TSS. Well, now you've got it on your schedule for next week. You go and you put in a ride description and you enter it in, and when you put in that training load in the future, it populates it on this chart in the form of a dashed line. So then it calculates exactly what those workouts are going to do to your long-term, short-term stress and your stress balance. So you can absolutely dial in how fresh you are going into the event. Hopefully that makes sense to anybody. If you don't, I'm happy to go over it again, or email me and I'll try to explain it. So now how exactly do you enter in that predictive data? I wanted to put it on a slide here so that you all had the instructions, but I'll also show you how to do it live after we just run through this. So you can either enter in planned or estimated training load. So again, if you were on that borrowed bike that didn't have your InfoCrank power meter, but you still wanted to get credit for the ride and have a training load, that would go into estimated or manual. So what you would do is you'd log into cycling analytics, click on a day in the past, and select add manual ride. Enter the ride title, maybe a brief description, and then put in your estimated training load. If you remember that chart that I showed you before, you'll all get a copy of it with these slides. You can estimate the training load, or you can look at a previous ride if you had the same workout in the past and just take that. Now, if you want to plan it going into the future, which is what you should all be doing going into Haute routes, and you want to get those dashed lines on that chart so you can dial it in, what you do is you click on a day in the future and you select add training plan, same thing, enter the ride title and description, and then you enter in training load of what you think it's going to be, and that creates the dashed line on the chart. So let's take a look at how you do that on cycling analytics here. This just happens to be my account, so I don't have a whole, I put in a few here, But if I wanted to enter one in the past, say I actually did a ride here, well, let's just add a manual ride. And I could put road ride with the team, hard intervals, 2 by 20 minutes at FTP. It was an hour and a half. And my training load then we'll put in is, whoops, not 150. We'll put in 100. So basically I'm saying that this road had the equivalent of a 1 hour maximum effort. That was the physiological toll that this workout took on me. So then I can save it. And then if I wanted to plan something in the future, I put in a few here. We'll put one here. And I'm going to add a training plan because it's in the future. That's just usually what I do. I can pick workouts that I've actually saved, or I can just make up a new one. And maybe this is going to be a road race. And it is going to be 3 hours. And so I'm going to say that the road race is going to be pretty hard. It's going to go from the gun. It's going to have a lot of climbing in it. So let's say I'm going to earn the, let's go 210 training load. And I'm just going to put in a brief description if I want to. So then I'm going to save it. If we want to see how that looks, it usually takes a minute to populate here now because I've added things into it. You can see that I've actually got dashed lines now. And it's telling me, okay, so at this race, I'm going to go in with a stress balance of 13. It's positive. I've got a short-term stress of 42 and a long-term stress of 56. And my load, I think, is going to be 100. And then here's the race the next day. 210 is my training load, stress balance of -5, short-term stress of 65, and a long-term stress of 59. So we can actually see now what those planned workouts that I've put in have done to me. So let's take that one step further and let's go back to rides. So this road race, I've decided, you know what? It's really not going to be a good thing for me to do. So I definitely want to delete it and I want to take it off. So maybe now I will instead add easy recovery ride. And my training load is going to be 40 and it's going to be 1 hour long. Easy peasy ride. So let's see if we see a difference. It might be a little hard. Oops, went to the wrong thing. So you see that peak really came down. Now I still have the, I think the next day, let's see, there it is, recovery ride, stress balance of 13, 55, 42. But what you really see is that peak really came down in value. So this is how you can actually manipulate your workouts in the future by planning them and adjusting those training loads. So you can absolutely dial in your peak form for the Haute route using training load and using predictive metrics. So please, everybody, start getting familiar with this. Hopefully start plugging it in. The big thing is that you really don't want to go into the Haute route fatigued. You don't want to go in tired, right? So let's go back to the slides. All right. I think go on to the next one. Okay, the final question. This is a $64,000 question. I'm full of American quotes or sayings these days. The $64,000 question was, I think, a game show in the 50s that contestants could compete to win $64,000 by answering questions, which was a lot of money back then. Not so much now, right? I mean, it's still a lot of money, don't get me wrong. Anyways, first off, it's completely individual. What are the optimal? Everybody wants to know, okay, so what's the best number for stress balance or long-term stress or short-term stress? You know, what are the magic numbers? Unfortunately, I can't give you a number because it's so individual. It's completely different for each person, and it really depends on the accumulation of previous data, results, and experience. Like I said, the more rides you upload, look back on those days where you felt like you didn't have a chain or nobody could stop you and everything just seemed effortless. Well, what did you do leading up to it? What was your stress balance that day? What was your training load? What was your short-term stress? You really need to get an understanding of how your body or your athlete body responds to different situations too. I have athletes who really like to go in with just a smidge of fatigue on their legs. Maybe they're right around 0, maybe they're just slightly negative, maybe -5 training stress balance. I have other athletes who need to go in completely fresh, somewhere between 10 and 20 training stress balance. It also depends on the type of an event. Definitely a multi-day event and something so physically demanding as the Haute route, you have to be rested going into that event. Maybe if it's just a short time trial or a short criterium, you can get by with a little bit of fatigue on your legs. But I always like to tell people too that, the week before the event, you've probably got the fitness that you've got. You're not going to get any fitter a week before. You do need to keep the engine tuned up and primed, but you definitely want to strive for, I would suggest for the Haute route riders, a stress balance between 10 and 20 starting on the first day. So hopefully that gives you an idea on at least a range to target, and for sure be above 0. Questions on any of that? Okay, so now you guys have the key to the castle. You've got the training load chart. You know how to put in predictive training load. You've got an awesome power meter to track your data, to learn, your individual training loads and what you're starting to acquire through your workouts, so you can plan them going forward. If you want some help doing that, let me know. We can set up a webinar and we can do it. I'm happy to do that for you guys. Again, I'm always here to help you. So I know we covered a lot today. Next week we'll give tips for a successful Haute route because it'll be the last time that I'll get a chance to present before some of you start your event in the Pyrenees. And if you have questions that you already know that you want to ask me about the event, shoot them my way, and then we'll also just we'll have a Q&A and tips on how to have a successful Haute route. I think we'll probably have some sort of promotion through social media too that people can send in questions and ask. So at this point, that's all I got. Thanks for attending our Power Simplified webinar on how to achieve peak form, and hopefully you'll all be back next week. Thanks a lot.